All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to this week's Tariff and Trade Update webinar. My name is Michelle Conley. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships at World Trade Center Utah, and we really appreciate you joining us today, and many of you joining us every week for these updates. I've said numerous times to people this week that one of these weeks there will be nothing to talk about. That is not this week. There's cutting edge breaking tariff news as of the last hour. And so Ben has been working, I think, right now to update our dashboard, but don't hold him to it if it's not 100% quite yet, but it will be shortly after this webinar. So as always, just a reminder that these are being recorded, and you can see this webinar and past versions on our YouTube channel, which will be posted in the chat. And also, please feel free to chime in with questions. Use the Q&A function. We love for these to be conversational and really address the issues that are most important to you all. I'm very excited about our guest today. Many of you have had the chance to interact with him, but Tim Stratford is joining us today to share his expertise from a 40-plus year career focused on China. He is a senior counsel and a member of the firm Covington, specializes in China. He's the chairman emeritus of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. He also served as the assistant U.S. trade representative from 2005 to 2010. I don't know anyone with more China expertise and insight knowledge than Tim, and I'm so pleased that you'll get to hear from him today. So with that, Ben, I'll let you give us some updates. What is going on as recently as an hour ago?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm going to share my screen real fast. And as always, remind folks, this is, you can always find our dashboard online. You can follow along or just share this with others. It's wtcutah.com/tariffs. You can get all the latest updates here. I'm going live off of this site now. So as you can see, I did fit in the update while we were doing the intro. Within the last hour, it was announced that Switzerland just got a deal. So we've been asked that quite a bit in these webinars over the last few weeks. Is what's the latest with Switzerland? What's the latest with Switzerland? So we're pending details, but there was a deal announced. So I linked the news article there for the deal. We're awaiting implementation and deal structure, and we'll update that on our website once we've got it. But within the last, I think it was 20 minutes, this deal was just announced. So it's already on the dashboard. Going to go through a few other updates before handing it over to Tim, but not take too long today. The other big update we're just tracking is the India tariff and the additional 25% on Russia. So as you'll remember, a few weeks ago, it was announced that India was hoping for somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 16% tariff deal. And right now it's at 50, including the oil tariff of the additional 25%. And so there was a swearing in of a new ambassador to India. Many of you may have seen, and Trump had mentioned in his remarks that this tariff is probably coming down. And so just tracking the news on this one, no formal actions as of this morning, but it seems to be progressing in the direction that these tariffs are likely to come down. We're going to go into China a little bit more with Tim, and we reviewed the deal structure last week. And so we're not going to do that in detail on my side with these China updates, but just to say that the November 10th date, which was this week, were when a lot of the aspects of the deal were set to be activated and implemented. And so we're just tracking those as the updates for China. There's no major update on Brazil or Colombia. So those, I know we're asked about those quite a bit, but those right now we're just continuously monitoring, but don't have any major updates there. The last quick, maybe two updates. One, Supreme Court. We heard this, the oral arguments on November 5th. We don't have any major updates in terms of formal procedures by the court, but what we do have is Polymarket. And so it's a good thing to monitor if you're wondering what where these tariffs stand and what the odds are. And as of yesterday, when I was looking, the Trump tariffs have about a 26% likelihood of maintaining their legality. And that's down from 48%. It was at 48% prior to the oral argument. So right now it's hovering around 26% on the poly market. So something to just keep an eye on. So for those people who bet on things like what the Supreme Court will vote on for tariffs, you're thinking these tariffs are going to be legal, you could probably make a premium in the poly market right now. And then the last update before we hand it over is the 232. So we've had several 232 implementations at this point in this administration, but there are 3 to keep an eye on that were released in April or early May that we expect to hear more about in the near future. Those are for semiconductors, critical minerals, and commercial aircraft and jet engines. So stay tuned for more details on those, but for right now, we're just monitoring and haven't heard any new updates on that front just yet. So that's it for me. Tim, I'm happy to hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. As I was saying before we went on the air, I'm very impressed with what the World Trade Center in Utah is doing to keep track of these things. I don't know any other state that's as on top of things. And so I really commend you. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Did that work?
Yep.
Very good. All right. Thank you. What I'd like to try to do today is approach things from a somewhat different angle, and people who've heard me talk before have seen me try to do this. I'll talk a little bit about the current tariffs that Ben was just discussing, but I want to try to put them in a broader context because it's very difficult. Number one, we go crazy having to wake up each day and see if the tariffs we're expecting to pay on our products are going to change. But I think, in terms of long-term business decisions, we need to try to get a sense of where is this going and how should we position ourselves so that as events continue to unfold between the United States and China, our company and our business are in a good position. And so I think we can do that best by looking at the underlying dynamics, and those will help us to interpret the day-to-day news and have a sense of whether we're going where we thought we would and whether we're planning accordingly. So, I pressed change slide. There we are. So let's talk about the big picture for a minute. The U.S. has always had concerns about the Chinese economic and geopolitical policies and practices. And, I worked at the U.S. Embassy in 1988, and we were dealing with some of the same issues then. But the U.S. view is now that China's impact has grown too big to ignore, and that the things we've tried to do in the previous decades to address our concerns simply haven't worked, so we have to do something different now. This really came to the fore during the first Trump administration, but the Biden administration basically continued it, and certainly we're seeing it in spades during the second Trump administration. But just to give an example, I remember sending a cable from the embassy in Beijing back to Washington in 1990, and it said, this year our trade deficit with China will be $6 billion. Well, in 2024, it was $295 billion. So it's a very different set of circumstances that we're dealing with. The Chinese view is that the disruptions we're seeing in the trading relationship right now are entirely the fault of the United States because things were going just fine from their perspective, and now we're putting on these tariffs and doing all these other types of things. But the US view is, well, what we were doing before didn't address our concerns, so we do have to take more disruptive actions. So right now, the US is seeking to constrain PRC initiatives that it sees as harming US interests, but trying to do it in a way that doesn't provoke an unacceptable level of retaliation from China. And so what we've seen is we're trying to not just shape Chinese policies, but we're trying to block some of the policies. So that's a much more aggressive position by the United States, and that's why the Chinese have been so upset and have been retaliating. So the Chinese government is trying to deter unwelcome US measures while also addressing its own vulnerabilities and identifying additional leverage points to potentially assert against the United States as needed. And I think the most prominent example of that is China said, aha, the United States needs rare earths. we can block those. And the United States has really paid attention to that. And so basically what we have is this kind of dynamic that's currently underway. So back in February of 2025, the United States imposed a slew of tariffs on the PRC under the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that you've all heard so much about. There were two types, basically. One was a 20% tariff because President Trump was not happy with Chinese efforts to block the flow of fentanyl precursors. And the second one was what he called the reciprocal tariffs that he opposed in differing rates on most countries around the world. And these are in addition to the tariffs that the US imposed during the first Trump administration under Section 301 of the Trade Act. So then China was very upset. They imposed retaliatory tariffs on certain US products and various sanctions on or initiated investigations of multiple US companies. So then the US imposed increasingly strict controls on export to China of advanced semiconductors and related technology. And the US Commerce Department drastically expanded the scope of the US end user-based export controls in what we call the affiliates rule that applied them to affiliates of Chinese companies and not just to the Chinese companies themselves. So in response, China rolled out new controls on the export of rare earth metals, including a proposed rule applying China's rare earth export licensing regime extraterritorially. So that would have caused a lot of problems for every industry that uses rare earth and rare earth magnets, and that turns out to be quite a few. So what we ended up was both countries recognizing that the other one had a gun to its head. So on October 30th, President Trump and President Xi met in Korea. They agreed to a one-year truce, and this is important. This isn't solving all the problems, but it's saying, okay, you got us, we got you, let's put our guns down for a year. So each side rolled back certain tariff and non-tariff measures, and China agreed that they would purchase some US agricultural products. So what is the situation today? The situation during this truce is that the US maintains a roughly 47% tariff on the average Chinese product. So that includes originally the 20% fentanyl tariff has been dropped down to 10%, and there's a 10% reciprocal tariff instead of the higher one that Trump originally proposed. There are, in addition, Section 301 tariffs on roughly 2/3 of Chinese products. These are typically set at 25%. And then there are the original underlying tariffs that the United States imposes on every country on a most favored nation basis, which average about 2 to 3%. So you add that all up, and the average Chinese product coming to the US now is 47%. The US also paused implementation of that affiliates rule for 1 year, and China has likewise paused for 1 year its most recently announced rare earth export controls. But there are other restrictions that continue to apply, and both countries continue to apply onerous licensing regimes in various areas. Semiconductors by the US and rare earths, there still are controls that we have to navigate as we're trying to get the rare earths. I've gone into the Ministry of Commerce, and so some of my colleagues, and talked to senior commerce officials and gotten licenses for some of our clients, but this is still a significant concern. So both sides appear to acknowledge the leverage that the other side possesses. The question is, how long before one side no longer feels constrained? So the analogy I use is that both countries are entering in a tunnel, and the tunnel is constraining what each side can do, where we can go, where we can move, and we're sort of seeing what we can do to block the other side without them blocking us too much in return. And so we have this back and forth sort of dance that's going on in this tunnel. But the question is, what happens when one country or the other feels like the other side doesn't have so much leverage anymore? For example, suppose China has its own sources of semiconductor equipment and so on and doesn't think it needs the US anymore. Or suppose the US has access to rare earths without relying on China. Then one side or the other may feel less constrained, and they'll exit the tunnel, but we have to figure out, okay, how long are we going to be in this tunnel? what's the accommodation that each side is going to be making to the other, and we see what the 1-year accommodation is now, and what happens when we leave the tunnel. So that's kind of where we are in the dynamic. So the question is, how do we do business under these circumstances? Well, I think the Trump administration has declared that we're going to have an America First policy. We're only going to do things that make sense for America. So you can think of that as a circle, including all the things that are American first. Well, China also is doing China first. And the question is, what areas of business are the overlap so that it makes sense from an American point of view to be doing these things? And it also makes sense from a Chinese point of view to be doing the same types of business. So my proposal is that we should be trying to identify what that overlapping space is and do business in that space, because then the US will feel it's in American interest for us to be doing that business, and China will feel that it's in China's interest for us to be doing that business. So what does that space look like, and how are we going to get there? Well, that's part of what we're sort of figuring out while both countries are going together through this tunnel. But there's obstacles. Pride, each country can't be seen as caving into the other country, and this complicates the dynamic. There's very profound distrust between the two governments. There's a technical difficulty of figuring out, what does that space really look like? What kinds of industries or what segments of a supply chain in a particular industry would fit in that overlapping space? We have domestic politics. Some people may want to block trade while others want to open it up. And so you have differences of view within a government. And then you have the idea of, okay, even if we figure out where we want to go, how do we transition there? What about companies that have already made investments? They've got supply chains that are wrapped up with the other country and so on. So this is basically the challenge that we're facing. When the United States is figuring out what looks in that overlapping space from an American point of view, they're sort of looking at it through 3 lenses. One is fair and balanced trade. There's been a long-term feeling that the Chinese economic development model doesn't really follow market principles and the WTO the way we had anticipated, and that this has caused a lot of problems. And I'll go into more detail on that in just a minute. That's kind of the work that I did when I was at USTR, because they're focused on trade policy. The second lens the US is looking at is in terms of national economic security. We want to make sure the kind of business that we're doing with China is such that it protects and supports our own innovation, our own industries, our own workers, and our supply chains. And so, when we've had supply chains blocked, or, we had personal protective equipment that we couldn't get, or pharmaceutical precursors that we couldn't get, during the pandemics and so on, we want to make sure that we have economic security. And that's part of what the Department of Commerce looks at. And Section 232 is one of the tools, not the only one, but one of the tools they use to try to safeguard national economic security in the United States. And then we've got national security in the more traditional sense. What kinds of critical technologies and industries and supply chains do we need to support in our own country? And we want to try to block the progress of China in those areas, just the way they want to block our progress in those areas. So when we're trying to figure out whether a particular type of business would fit in that overlap space, we need to try to put our US government thinking cap on and say, now, if I were a US official concerned about these things, what would I think about this type of business? And how is the US policy toward this business likely to evolve over the coming months and years? So we have to think about the Chinese trade policies, as I mentioned, because our companies, we want to make business investment and sourcing decisions that make sense. And so I've come up with a hypothesis that I call the frown curve, which describes MNC success in China over time. Sorry to sound so pessimistic, but if you look at this curve, you can see steps that many American and other foreign industries have experienced when they've gone into China. I experienced it most directly myself when I worked for General Motors, and we made an investment in China. We had to do it as a joint venture in order to be approved to be in China, we had to promise that we would bring our best technology. We also had to comply with local content rules. So we had to help build the supply base for our industry. And then as the Chinese supply base developed, Chinese competitors started to draw on the same supply base. And China started to put some policies in that gave our competitors advantages in the Chinese market over us. And then we got to the point where we were starting to lose the market share that we had built. And China was starting to have their subsidized products go into other markets around the world. When I was at General Motors, our Shanghai joint venture, which I helped to set up, was a cash cow in the company and really helped save the company even when we had the financial crisis. But last year, General Motors wrote off $5.5 billion from that joint venture because the environment had changed. And so we need to understand for our own industries, what industrial policies does China have for our industry? And what is a successful path for us in China, given these kinds of policies? In fact, at Covington, we have done very extensive research on Chinese industrial policies in different industries. We developed a taxonomy of measures that they use at different stages of this development curve. And I'm not expecting you to read these 130 something different measures, but these are the different types of things that can take place at different stages of an industry's development in China. And we need to look at where they are and where we fit in order to have a business strategy in China that's going to be sustainable and in our best interest as a company. Now, as we're thinking about that intersecting area, it's useful to know what areas is China trying to become self-sufficient in, because then we're liable to hit a lot of headwinds if we're trying to develop the same business, but they're saying we want to be self-sufficient. So if you look at the latest 5-year plan that China is working on, the plenum decisions of the Communist Party that were just made, government work reports in the last 3 years, here are some examples of some industries where China says we need to develop independent and controllable industries and supply chains. So this is just an example. There are many other industries where they have similar goals. But what it means is if you're going to invest in China, or even if you're going to sell to China, you need to understand in detail what China's plans are for your industry so that you can do something that's going to make sense. Here are a similar list, but these are some technologies that are of concern to the US government. There are 4 House committee chairs that have asked the Department of Commerce to consider imposing US export bans or other restrictions targeted toward China related to all these industries. And again, there are many other industries that are of concern. But if you're in one of these sectors, you're going to have to think, well, is the US government going to put export controls, or is my chairman going to be hauled up before Congress to testify about why we are doing this in China? So this just gives some idea. I don't even know what a lot of these things are, but fortunately I have colleagues who do. But this is the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. In addition to those, Ben mentioned the Section 232 actions. Here's a list that I've seen of industries for which the Commerce Department has initiated or completed national security investigations under Section 232. And so this means that if you're in one of these industries, you're going to have to track very closely what the US policies are that may restrict your ability to do business with China in these sectors. And it could affect the tariff rate, it could include other restrictions on trade. So in the face of this dynamic, when you talk to Chinese officials, including officials that spoke, Wednesday at WTC from the China Council of Promotion of International Trade, they are sending the message that China is rolling out the red carpet for foreign investors. And the fact of the matter is that that's true. That's genuine. And a lot of companies are reporting that the governments are making real accommodations to maybe help them find the right venue and subsidize this and give them tax breaks and so on, because they're very keen to have you there. That's genuine. But the challenge is, at the same time that this is going on, the MNCs also have to consider the following. China's drive for self-sufficiency. They want you, but maybe they only want you for 3 years until they don't need you anymore. They might have to retaliate against US companies if the US government does something they don't like, and you might be a target depending on the industry and so on. There's something that's called deep sea fishing, where local governments are going to companies that are not from their own province and saying, you owe us a lot of money for fees or taxes, because the local governments are looking for revenue because they have big budget deficits right now. And you also have to look at the market prospects for your industry, given what's going on in China right now. But at the same time, multinationals need to recognize that there are important niche markets that they should be competing in, and that could be very profitable for their companies. They need to stay abreast of what's going on in China and how it'll affect their competition in other countries. So they need to have eyes and ears on the ground in China, and they need to develop risk mitigation strategies. So this is kind of the environment that I see in China. Again, my firm, Covington and Burling, is one of the large international firms. We're especially known for looking at how policy and government actions affect business. We've got a lot of former senior government officials from around the world that are part of our firm in various offices, and happy to answer any questions. And I think I went 5 minutes over, so I apologize.
You're great, Tim. I could listen to you talk about China all day. I always learn so much. If anyone does have questions, feel free to chime in and put those in the Q&A. Tim, I'm curious. I like what you outlined about how we need to find these overlapping areas of interest. Do you think it's going to happen? Like when you use your crystal ball in 5 or 10 years, when we're looking at U.S.-China trade relations, are things smoothed over and we figured out the ways to work together and the ways we need to work separately, or is it still challenging in the way it is now?
Well, I think we can have a constructive relationship, but it's not going to be warm and fuzzy the way that it was especially in the late 90s and the early 2000s. That was kind of a golden age. China had joined the WTO. China actually talked about, when they joined the WTO, the big billboards around town that have propaganda on them talked about how China is aligning with the world. And now that's not the goal. Now the goal is for China to chart its own path and not to be bound by what other countries are doing. And so it's not the same warm and fuzzy feeling. And on the one hand, you're welcome, but on the other hand, there are a lot of suspicions and things like that. So I think we can manage the relationship, but it's going to have to be on different terms. I think we are going to have a lot of trade between our two countries, but it will be limited. It will not include certain types of high technologies in different sectors, but there will still be trade and there'll still be people-to-people exchanges. But I think it will take some time before it's as warm as it used to be. And I think it could take 5 or 10 years, I think.
Tim, or Michelle, I'd like to take a point of privilege since we don't have any questions right now from the group. I hear your presentation, and with all the depth and experience that you have, Tim, I wonder your perspective on, I'm hearing your presentation, I'm seeing a lot of concerns or considerations about national security, as well as economic emergency, and these themes playing out in terms of the Supreme Court decision or potential decision coming up. Mm-hmm. When we heard the oral arguments, it seemed there were a lot of arguments in there, but I didn't feel like it was really laid out the consideration of, in the case of China, congressional authority in this world is really tough to solve this issue because it's dynamic, it's quick moving. That stable baseline and certainty could be a real challenge as it pertains to China, because the second you have it, something else pops up, right? So that agility of IEEPA and the way tariffs are being used by the administration really puts that leverage at the forefront. And so with that coming up in the Supreme Court decision, I wonder, with this in mind, how you view that, because the congressional sort of locked it in, great, we have a deal, is a bit of a threat, no? Because then the dynamics will just shift around their objectives against the baseline, whatever deal is worked out, rather than remaining agile through this situation?
Well, no, obviously that's a very good question. The administration has a kind of an advantage when it comes to China compared with other countries, because we have the existing 301 case that started during the first Trump administration, and USTR could tag in a lot of other things related to China under 301, even if the Supreme Court decides that IEEPA was not a justifiable grounds for the fentanyl tariffs and for the reciprocal tariffs. So I think that for China in particular, the U.S. government has more leverage. Let me just say, in a way, I think our two countries are very fortunate that we do have this space of trade that can help be some sort of ballast for the relationship. The people-to-people relationship is really, I mean, I'll even sound sentimental. I think it's a very precious thing for millions of people in both countries, and it's beneficial to both countries to have the relationship. We didn't have this kind of trading relationship with the Soviet Union, and so we didn't have that counterbalance to the geopolitical hostilities between the two states. And I think as long as the U.S. and China have some fundamental differences about territorial claims and about the way the trading system should work and so on, there's going to be a limit to the type of cooperation we can do. But I think when we maximize that cooperation, it's economically beneficial for countries, but I think it's beneficial at a much deeper level as well.
Thanks, Tim.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us today. I want to make a real quick announcement. A lot of you that are joining us today are members of World Trade Center Utah. We do have a board meeting on Wednesday, and we'll actually have Jeff Gottman, the deputy U.S. trade representative, joining that meeting. So it'll be a really great opportunity to engage with him and ask questions about your businesses. If you're not a member of World Trade Center Utah and want to know more about getting involved, feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thank you again, Tim and Ben. Everyone check out the dashboard that Ben is updating in real time about the SWIFT deal, and we will see you next Friday.